Our first plenary speaker is Dr. Ranilo B. Hermida. Dr. Hermida obtained his undergraduate degrees at the Faculty of Philosophy of the Ecclesiastical Faculties of the University of Santo Tomas, a civil degree, AP, in Classical Liberal Arts in 1980, and an ecclesiastical degree, Bachelor of Philosophy in 1978, both summa cum laude. He has also a postgraduate ecclesiastical degree, Licentiate in Philosophy 1980, from the same faculty. During the graduation ceremonies in March of 1980, he was the only summa cum laude among more than 5,000 graduates in the entire University of Santo Tomas. There were 90 magna cum laudes and 104 cum laudes. He was also the Rector's Awardee for the academic excellence with the highest average among all the awardees in the school year 1979 to 1980. So he was assigned the privilege of delivering the address of response in their behalf during the awarding ceremonies. He is the founder of the Faculty of Philosophy Students Forum, which was the recipient of the Pope Leo XIII Award for Social Involvement during his term as its first president. Dr. Hermida later obtained a civil postgraduate degree, MA in Philosophy 1999 from the Ateneo de Manila University, and a PhD in Philosophy last 2010 from Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, where his dissertation received the Faculty of Arts Postgraduate Publications Award. He has delivered lectures in various conferences, both national and international, and has also published articles in both local and foreign journals. His major work is entitled Imagining Modern Democracy, a Habermasian Assessment of the Philippine Experiment, which was published by the State University of New York Press and won the 2016 Scholarly Work Award of the School of Humanities, Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Hermida is presently an Associate Professor at the Philosophy Department of the Ateneo de Manila University. He is also the Assistant Director of the St. Thomas of Villanova Institute, the Philosophy Department of the Augustinian Friars of the Philippines. He is the immediate past Editor-in-Chief of Budhi, a journal of ideas and culture. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ranilo Hermida.
Thank you, Rainier, and good morning, dear colleagues. I would like, first of all, to congratulate the editorial board of Critique, together with the chair and faculty of the Philosophy Department of the University of Santo Tomas for organizing this conference on critical theory. It is timely to discuss this theme today in light of our present circumstances. And I thank them for inviting me, and I am in a special way heartened that this conference is being held in this familiar territory, where I spent 4 memorable years of my life, as a resident of the Central Seminary and a student in the Faculty of Philosophy. I am gratified by this opportunity to revisit my roots. You are familiar with this famous verse from the immortal 4 Quartets of T.S. Eliot. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. But I think I'm getting carried away by nostalgia. I'm forgetting that this is not a homecoming, so let me stop my reminiscing and proceed to my lecture. You know, I was in Baguio the other day. I gave a talk at SNU, and I had a courteous call with the Bishop of Baguio, Benguet, who is my classmate. And we were together here for 4 years. We even shared a room during our first year, but enough of that. So this is the outline of my talk. I'll now go to the introduction. The philosopher is often taken to task about his role in society, and the inclusion of philosophy in our courses is challenged in terms of its relevance to the present. This was never the case in the earlier times, when the philosopher was revered as the man of wisdom, and enjoyed his place in society as an esteemed teacher and even royal advisor. The current state of misgiving towards philosophy, which extends to the whole of the humanities, in fact, is not an entirely new development, however. The end of philosophy had been proclaimed matter-of-factly by some of the most significant thinkers at different periods in history. In his book, Philosophical Political Profiles, Jürgen Habermas inquires whether philosophy is possible and necessary anymore. I quote, "The unsettling question remains whether, after the downfall of systematic philosophy, and now even the retreat of philosophy itself, it is still possible to do philosophy. And if it is, for what purpose philosophy is needed? Why should not philosophy, like art and religion, fall victim to the world historical process of rationalization, described in historical terms by Max Weber and expressed conceptually by Horkheimer and Adorno and their dialectic? Why should not even philosophy itself fade away in the graveyard of a spirit that can no longer affirm and realize itself as absolute? Does philosophy still have a purpose today? And will it tomorrow?" There are at least twofold factors that may be cited as the basis for the contention that philosophy has come to an end or has lost its aim. The first is the predominance of capitalism and the materialism engendered in its wake. In this state of affairs, the value of everything is measured in terms of the economic gain it can generate. In light of this evaluation, therefore, philosophy is deemed wanting insofar as it is reckoned to serve no utilitarian purpose. The second is the more insidious challenge because it goes to the heart of philosophy as an enterprise of rationality. Habermas calls it scientism, which he defines as the tendency of positivism to regard the methods of the natural sciences as the only legitimate form of meaningful inquiry. The emphasis on materialist over other values is corollary to orthodox Marxist theory of the evolution of society and proceeds from its fundamental tenet that law, religion, morality, and the whole socio-cultural superstructure are merely derivatives of the economic mode of production. Habermas rejected this view as a misreading of history and asserted, quote-unquote, the opposite view that the normative structures of culture, morality, and collective identity do not simply follow economic or system imperatives and that they evolve according to their own logic, end of quote. Habermas elaborates this rejoinder to scientism in his first major work, Knowledge and Human Interests, which he developed into a systematic history of ideas with a practical intention. And the intention is precisely to show how positivism has mutilated our reason and swallowed it whole into a limited theory and practice of science. It is imperative for Habermas, therefore, that we recuperate a more comprehensive concept of reason and disavow the limited understanding to which it had been consigned, as if only empirical or scientific validity claims about factual state of affairs can be rationally contested and redeemed. At the same time, however, Habermas declares that as philosophy confronts a modern social reality that has itself undergone dramatic and irreversible developments towards complexity, pluralism, and diversity, it cannot remain the same. inasmuch as these developments place strong limits on what philosophy can legitimately aspire to explain. Philosophy, as theorized and practiced previously, has to be recast. This is the real meaning of the end of philosophy. The clearing of a new path towards a way of thinking that is more competent and appropriate to modern social existence. The end of philosophy is therefore not a cause for disquiet and alarm, but a source of excitement and interest. Habermas refashions philosophy after the conception of knowledge inspired by German idealism, according to which knowledge is to be at the service of human autonomy. Can we have the next slide, please? Philosophy, as an enterprise of reason, is rational to the degree that it liberates humanity from the tutelage it has imposed upon itself. Philosophy is to be knowledge grounded in the emancipatory interest. Its project is the forging of a theory of society with a practical intention. This new phase and task of philosophy is critical theory. Critical theory, origin and direction. As you all very well know, the term critical theory was first used in reference to the social scientific research program conducted at the Institute for Social Research by thinkers from widely divergent fields of thought to present a new interpretation of Marxist theory, focusing their speculation on issues and problems that were rarely tackled by more orthodox approaches to Marxism. The orientation of the Institute was initially provided by Max Horkheimer, who was the director in its incipient years. It came to be known later as simply and famously the Frankfurt School, because it was at Frankfurt University in Germany where the Institute was established in 1923 with funds provided by a wealthy industrialist named Felix Weil. The general objective of the school was to revitalize Marxist analysis and to engage in research that is socially scientific and simultaneously oriented toward human emancipation. The approach was to be interdisciplinary. Philosophers, sociologists, economists, legal scholars, and even students of psychiatry and literature collaborated on large-scale studies of the sources and structure of contemporary social pathologies. Philosophical analysis was coupled with empirical social research with the goal of critically identifying and indicting sources of injustice, domination, and oppression. The social research program of Jürgen Habermas and also the moral philosophical work of Axel Honneth may be considered further developments of critical theory. What further distinguished the school were the essential features it assigned to critical theory. One, critical theory is reflective, as differentiated from the natural science theory, which it reckoned as objectifying. Two, critical theory is cognitive in character, as it aims towards enlightening individuals so as to clearly determine what their true interests are. Third, critical theory is emancipatory because it suggests a process through which human agents can liberate themselves from a form of coercion that is self-imposed, being the result of their self-prostration over conscious human action. Here is a summary of the features of the Frankfurt School. All the members agreed that critical theory must be knowledge and must show ideological beliefs and attitude to be false. Otherwise, critical theory could not have its proper emancipatory effect, which depends on its ability to make those who adopt it able to withstand the pressure of the legitimatory apparatus of society. Critical theories must be true because the legitimizing ideologies of the society claim to be true. There is one essential element of critical theory, moreover, that is a common orientation among all its adherents and practitioners. Critical theory necessarily entails the critique of ideology. Ideology understood in the negative sense and as label for worldviews that exclusively reflect the particularistic interests of dominant social groups and yet are presented as universally valid or true. Habermas is emphatic of ideology critique. For him, philosophy, particularly as critical theory, is a normative undertaking. The idea of critical theory, after all, is to provide a critical diagnosis of the times, which is to say a diagnosis from a normative standpoint, from which how things could be better becomes visible. Critical theorists together maintain that the unveiling of exclusivist interests behind ideologies serves to empower social agents to enact social change. From cognitive interests to communicative action. Habermas has always assigned the philosopher to the role of being the guardian of reason. He claims that the problem of rationality is ever the central question in every philosophical discussion. Although he is critical of the modernist approach, or rather, appropriation of rationality in a restrictedly positivist and instrumentalist manner, Habermas is secure in the capacity of reason to establish valid standards and to tackle the challenging dilemmas of human life. He concurs with the postulate that rationality is the fundamental principle behind social change. It is therefore the abiding task of the philosopher to identify the evolving patterns by which rationality is appropriated in the course of history and to analyze how such appropriation has either advanced or hindered the progress of society. And he is confident that this quest will indicate rational grounds for social hope. The rejection of positivism is centered on its claim of an objective knowledge that is devoid of human interests. Habermas rejects that claim, inspired by the finding of American pragmatism that all forms of knowledge are laden with interest. He exposes the presence of an unacknowledged connection between knowledge and interest in the sciences. He suspects that the objectivist claim is an offshoot of the ontological illusion of pure theory, which the sciences still cling to. There is no pure theory, however, since there are no theoretical propositions which are unrelated to empirical variables. Habermas declares that once the connection is grasped, the objectivist illusion dissolves and makes visible a knowledge constitutive interest. He identifies three distinct interests: the interest in instrumental control, in understanding, and in emancipation. Habermas employed his theory of knowledge and human interests in overturning the illusion of pure theory. He then shifted into a theory of language in his critical theory. This shift is what is known as the linguistic turn in his thinking. His theory of language was first formulated as a doctrine of dialogue without coercion, and later on presented as universal pragmatics, the name he proposed for his research program aimed at reconstructing the universal validity basis of speech. The linguistic turn by way of universal pragmatics may seem to be a puzzling and unwarranted detour in the critical theory of Habermas. The connection between the formal conditions of rational discourse and the emancipatory orientation of critical theory is not easily comprehended. It becomes clear, however, when we realize that for Habermas, all forms of prejudice, self-deception, and error that significantly thwart the emancipatory potential of the persons or groups so affected are appropriated in the self-formative process of an individual or group which is facilitated by language. So the goal of ensuring the autonomy of human agents is blocked by constraints that are rooted in language. Universal pragmatics provides the methodological framework whereby the said constraints are revealed and can thus be contested. Universal pragmatics focuses on the pragmatic context of language. Communication is not a purely linguistic exercise. Speech is also an action. The concept of speech acts was adopted by Habermas from the work of Austin and Searle. A linguistic utterance has a performative component, which is to say that when a speaker says something, he is simultaneously doing something, and that is entering into a certain relation with his hearer. So the essential notion operative in universal pragmatics is that there are no speech acts without dialogical participants. That is, speech is not possible without, at the very least, a speaker and a hearer engaged in the process of communication. Communication is coming to an understanding through the medium of language, and it involves at once two levels. One, the level of propositional content which is communicated. Two, the level of intersubjectivity on which speaker and hearer, through elocutionary acts, establish the relations that permit them to come to an understanding with one another. Habermas rejected the modernist prejudice of equating and limiting the function of reason in social life to instrumental or strategic rationality. Not all social actions can be typified as oriented towards success or towards the appearance of a desired state, which can in any given situation be causally produced through goal-oriented action or omission. Because he argues, if all action is strategic, then we have to accuse all actors engaging in social action of being calculative and manipulative, treating one another mere conditions or means to their respective ends, either through enticement or intimidation. Habermas finds such underhanded mode of interaction incapable to account for how the social fabric is able to hold society together steadfastly. There is another category of rational, purposive action. Habermas designates it as communicative action. This is part of his project to rehabilitate the idea of rationality in what he considers the unfinished project of modernity. Communicative action is the orientation towards coming to an understanding between the speaker and hearer, between ego and alter. Communicative actors act differently from calculative actors insofar as they subordinate their individual goals to their desire to reach a common understanding with other social actors. Habermas writes, reaching understanding is a process of reaching agreement among speaking and acting subjects. An agreement that meets the conditions of rationally motivated assent to the content of an utterance has a rational basis. Agreement can indeed be objectively obtained by force, but what comes to pass manifestly through outside influence or the use of violence cannot count subjectively as agreement. Agreement rests on convictions. The agreement is based on a claim that a speaker proposes to the hearer, who may either accept or reject the claim. The basis for the reaction to the claim of the speaker is its evaluation by the hearer based on the presence or absence of rational grounds. Habermas believes that there is at all times a sense of rationality embedded in every communicative action. There are three validity claims that the speaker may possibly raise when he attempts to reach understanding with his hearer. The first is truth, Wahrheit. He claims that the propositional content or existential presupposition of his speech act is true. The second is normative legitimacy or rightness. She claims that her statement is correct within the given context. The third is authenticity or truthfulness. He claims that his pronouncement is a sincere expression of his interiority. When a speaker is able to persuade her hearer that the claim she makes is rational and deserves to be recognized, there can arise a rationally motivated consensus that may serve to coordinate future action. It should be borne in mind, moreover, that the process of coming to an understanding that both speaker and hearer mutually engage in cannot be attained in a situation where they regard each other as strategic adversaries bent on pushing a private agenda to achieve personal objectives. Habermas stresses that precisely the goal of coming to an understanding is to bring about an agreement that terminates in the intersubjective mutuality of reciprocal understanding, shared knowledge, mutual trust, and accord with one another. This means that both speaker and hearer must consider each other as partners equally intent on the accomplishment of a common goal. Unlike an ordinary sentence, whose intelligibility depends on its being grammatical, that is to say, its conformity to an established system of recognized rules for the use of language, the three validity claims we mentioned require something more beyond language in order to be intelligible. The validity of the propositional content of an utterance depends on whether the proposition stated represents a fact, or whether the existential presupposition of a mentioned propositional content holds. The validity of an intention expressed depends on whether it corresponds to what is actually intended by the speaker. And the validity of utterance performed depends on whether his action conforms to a recognized normative background. Whereas a grammatical sentence fulfills the claim of comprehensibility, a successful utterance must satisfy three additional validity claims. It must count as true. It must count as truthful. It must count as right. A fundamental question that needs to be answered is about the source of the elocutionary force of an utterance. In other words, how coming to understanding is attained, or how the speaker is able to persuade the hearer to enter into an intersubjective relationship through communication. Habermas answers this question by asserting that the hearer can be rationally motivated to accept the content proposed by the speaker. Every communication contains the immanent obligation to redeem the validity claim it makes. Universal pragmatics is more than just about the fundamental norm of rational speech. It is an emancipatory science, as it points to a larger vision of society. A society where the reign of truth, freedom, and justice can flourish through the inherent structures of social action and language. Habermas argues that the truth and virtue, facts and values, theory and practice are inseparable, because the truth of statements is linked in the last analysis to the intention of the good and true life. The overarching point of critical theory is that our interest in emancipation impels us to initiate or promote efforts towards building more humane societies by advocating a rigorous analysis of the complex relationships between espoused ideals and social structures. Now, a preamble to a critical theory of Philippine society. One implication of engaging in critical theory is the revision of the way philosophy is to be conceived and practiced. Habermas suggests some kind of demotion for philosophy. Philosophy must be gently but firmly knocked off its pedestal as a discipline with a special claim to transcendent foundational truth, and assigned a more humble but more socially significant role, one that was tailored specifically to the values and challenges of a secular, post-metaphysical, democratic society. Modern society has developed immensely to an extent that overtaxes the capacity of philosophy to explain using only its distinct concepts and characteristic frameworks. Philosophy has to abandon its entitlement to clarify exclusively the foundation of all knowledge. Instead, it has to cooperate with the empirical sciences in explicating structures of worldviews and forms of life. The questions for us to wrestle with are these. Are we prepared to embrace this reinvention of philosophy? Are we ready to embark on this expanded project for philosophy? Habermas narrates that he was just a teenager when he sat before the radio and experienced what was being discussed before the Nuremberg or tribunal. He was shocked to learn that some of his fellow Germans, instead of being struck by the ghastliness, began to dispute the justice of the trial, procedural questions, and questions of jurisdiction. Max Pensky writes how Habermas was dismayed that philosophy in post-war Germany could carry on business as usual, as though the period between 1933 and 1945 could simply be bracketed out of consideration. He was scandalized that the very idea that philosophy must transform itself in response to the German disaster met with deep resistance. During his university studies at Bonn and Göttingen from 1949 to 1954, Habermas tells us that he had two major experiences of disillusionment. The first was a crushing realization concerning Martin Heidegger. It was a great shock for him to discover that the philosopher he so admired had written in 1935 of the inner truth and greatness of the Nazi movement. The discovery came when Heidegger republished his 1935 lectures on metaphysics in 1953 without retraction of the astonishing passage. Instead, he added an explanatory note that the greatness he was referring to of the Nazi movement denoted the encounter between global technology and modern man. As he recalled much later, then I saw that Heidegger, in whose philosophy I had been living, had given this lecture in 1935 and published it without a word of explanation. That's what really disturbed me. His second great shock was the discovery of the Nazi past of both of his dissertation supervisors. What about the study and teaching of philosophy in our country? Does it factor in the historical upheavals that our country has undergone in the last 3 decades, some of which happened in the lifetime of many of us who are here in this hall? I am referring to the two successful people power revolutions of 1986 and 2001 that ousted a dictator and a scoundrel, respectively, from the presidency, and the third poor people power revolution that began as a protest against the arrest of the scoundrel, but later on surfaced the neglect of the social question in the first two manifestly political revolutions. We have a new philosophy curriculum, but does it significantly vary from what we have always had, except for some additional courses which were included because there is now room for more units, as some of the courses have been absorbed in the senior high school? Does it take into account the present Duterte regime, its historical revisionism, and blatant disregard for due process and the rule of law? Critical theory is a movement of collaboration with the other disciplines in a substantive and productive reciprocal dialogue with the newer adjacent disciplines that it had traditionally held at arm's length. While thinkers who were trained primarily as philosophers initiated the critical theory movement, critical theory is not an attempt to sustain the position of philosophy as a primum inter pares, a first among equals, with the other sciences serving ancillary functions. Instead, critical theory situates philosophy as unum inter pares, one among equals. The hierarchical arrangement of the sciences is forsworn, and the objective is for the various disciplines to fit with one another in relations of supplementing and reciprocally presupposing. What is the structure of our philosophy departments and their collocation within our university or college? I know that in still a good number of universities in the country, philosophy is a separate and independent department, a service department catering to all the other schools or colleges. In some institutions, I think like the University of Santo Tomas, there is a philosophy department in every college. Is that right? But even in such a structure, I wonder how much of interdisciplinary collaboration does philosophy endeavor to forge with the other disciplines? I would not be surprised if the philosophy department is hardly in dialogue with the particular school or college it is lodged in. It may be just structurally situated, but not communicatively engaged with the school or college it belongs to. Is the philosophy department in a college of education, for instance, more oriented towards a critical theory of our educational system? Or is the philosophy department in a school of economics involved in research and analysis of how the steering media of money and the profit motive of businesses foist oppression and inequity in our society? One of the biggest perpetrators of irrationality is the media. And I'm not referring to Mokausan or the purveyors of fake news and alternative truth, but to mainstream media. You know, I have been wishing for an encounter with the weather newscaster of one of the biggest television stations in the country, who always ends his report with his signature tagline, "Ang buhay ay weather lang." I wonder if he realizes the sense of helplessness he is conveying, especially to the young audiences. It smacks of fatalism. What happens to freedom? Are we merely victims of our circumstances, without the power to overcome them and determine our life according to our own choosing? The tagline, by the way, was popularized by a discredited president and brandished as an expression of resignation to the abuses of those in power. Panahon lang yan. Darating din ang panahon natin. Weather lang yan. Anyway, their time will surely pass away. They will have their comeuppance, and we will have our opportunity to get back and get even with them. Or as in the case of that impeached president, we will just wait for our own time, and then it will be our turn to help ourselves rob the tails of this country. I really want to meet this self-appointed kuya and take him to task for his reckless and tactless remark 5 evenings a week. The collaboration with other disciplines also entails expanding the sources of our researches and publications. In reading Habermas, one learns a great deal from a range of classical authors in several disciplines, whom he brings to life with astonishing brilliance and audacity. This is what makes his works very tedious, but at the same time, very instructive to study. Critical theorists link theory and practice, both noting the effects of social practices on theory formation and formulating theory with a view of emancipating the marginalized. Theories are not developed in a vacuum or from the lofty heights of an ivory tower, nor from the comfort of an office armchair. They are woven from the experience of actively engaging with society, wrestling with social issues, being immersed in the crucible of events and even conflicts as the occasion demands. This is how Habermas developed his theories. In one of his interviews he stated, "The rhythm of my personal development intersected with the great historical events of the time. His major works were also responses to historical incidents and current social debates." The importance of linking theory to practice can be further appreciated by examining the mutual functionality they serve each other. Theory formation provides a reference, a prototype, or a criterion for the scrutiny of existing conditions. The testing of theory validates or falsifies it. The value of a theory is proportional to its relevance to the reality it seeks to reflect and ameliorate. Let me share with you how I arrived at my decision to write about the Philippine political system versus its actual practice. When I was thinking about the topic for my dissertation, I did an inventory of my list of research and publication. And I noticed I only had a single work on the Philippines. I thought this was an embarrassing lacuna in my scholarship as a Filipino. That is why I decided to write on Philippine democracy. There is also a personal reason, which a story I already narrated and some of you may have heard already, about my choice to focus on our present constitution. Prior to the plebiscite for its ratification in 1987, a nationwide education campaign was spearheaded by the Simbahang Lingkod ng Bayan. I was the coordinator of Simbahang Lingkod ng Bayan in Camarines Sur province, since I was also with the Ateneo de Naga University as a coordinator of the Student Services Office, and I was also the chancellor at the time of the Archdiocese of Cáceres. So we had a team going from parish to parish, explaining and campaigning for the ratification of the Constitution. On January 16, 1987, while on our way to a parish for a campaign seminar, the public bus my team was riding on collided head-on with another passenger vehicle. Almost 20 people died on the spot. I was unconscious for several hours, for 8 hours. In fact, I was placed together with the dead. Fortunately for me, that happened in the hometown of my wife, where some people knew me. I burped and the nurse who passed by recognized me. And she said, "This man is still alive. This is Rani. This is the husband of my friend." My name was included twice in the list of fatalities. The first in a noontime radio newscast, and the second in the opening prayer of a symposium where my wife was the MC. My wife just came from the hospital, she went to the symposium, and in the opening prayer, the priest said, "Let us pray for Hermida who passed away." I did not die, of course. I am not a ghost. I lived on to write a dissertation and a book on Philippine Constitution, for which I would have become an unwitting martyr. The unmasking of cognitive interests points not only to the possibility, but indeed to the necessity of emancipation. For the history of science, technology, and communication is also the history of political domination and ideological distortion. Our interest in emancipation, and more so our striving towards that goal, is an obligation born of our being philosophers. We are philosophers. Supposedly, we are guardians of rationality. Every form of injustice and inhumanity is likewise a form of irrationality. We have to redeem our claim, the claim that is attached to our name. You remember this line from the Analects of Confucius. Let the ruler be a ruler, the subject a subject, the father a father, the son a son. To this tenet we should now add, let the philosopher be a philosopher. In his doctrine of the rectification of names, Qingming, Confucius held that the conduct of the individual fulfill the requirements of the social role or persona. The rules of performance are contained within the name itself. That is an essential requirement of an ordered society. To paraphrase Confucius then, if the philosopher departs from being the guardian of rationality, how can he fulfill that name? And now let us interrogate ourselves. How were we taught philosophy by our teachers? And how do we teach philosophy to our students? Is philosophy solely romancing the text, which for the most part is sourced from foreign thinkers? Romancing the text, that is the phrase that accordingly one senior Filipino philosophy teacher repeats like a mantra in his class. Romancing the text. How do we evaluate our teachers? What kind of publications or researches do we expect or demand from them? Do we give premium to their attention to and coverage of conditions in our country? Can we continue doing philosophy in the Philippines and yet maintain our reflective indifference to or philosophical disregard of Philippine society where we live and move and have our being? Habermas challenges us to review and update our vision of the proper tasks and scope of philosophizing, which should proceed from an overarching or meta-philosophical view of our own times, intellectual landscapes, historical situations, and social demands, making our relationship with our own times the center rather than the byproduct of the activity of philosophy itself. Critical theorists are public intellectuals. Barbara Fultner describes Habermas as a public intellectual par excellence, contributing on a regular basis to the editorial pages of major newspapers and engaging in public dialogue with other major figures ranging from Jacques Derrida, Michel Foucault, and Richard Rorty to then Cardinal Ratzinger, now Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. There have been, and there are still, so many raging issues in our society. We are all familiar with them. Have the philosophers of this country raised their voice to be heard? Have our philosophical associations issued a manifesto or statement on any of these issues? I am afraid our answer is negative. We are all complicit in this complacency. And I am not exempting myself from my own castigation. Critical theory must specify where and how it may be actualized in practice. We are not the only saviors of our society. but we are also its saviors. We have to delineate clearly and strictly our role concerning our status and limits as academics. The primary locus of our intervention, of course, is the classroom. We may continue to teach our students based on the famous Socratic dictum, the unexamined life is not worth living. But we have to sharpen the critical skills of our students based on the less known but more urgent Socratic dictum, the unexamined thought is not worth having. Outside the confines of the classroom, the public sphere awaits us. The arena opened up in modern society, distinct from the state and the economy. A site for the production of and circulation of discourse that can in principle be critical of the state, a theater for debating and deliberating rather than for buying and selling. In the public sphere, the ordinary citizens can exercise their rational agency by participating in informal discourses that can give voice to social problems, make broad demands, articulate public interest or needs, and thus attempt to influence the political process more from normative points of view than from the standpoint of particular interests. The prospect of the public sphere is often frustrated, unfortunately, by the dominance of state bureaucracies and market economies, which results in squeezing shut the narrow public space between state and market economy, transforming active citizens into passive clients and economic consumers. What we can do in this regard is to support specific and focused analysis of the concrete sites of irrationality, or we can conduct the research and analysis ourselves. For this enterprise, we need to expand our knowledge and supplement our skills with applied research tools and techniques. We can also join social movements which can serve as potential carriers of emancipatory social and political change. Habermas cautions us, however, to be discriminating in our choice. Of social movements, as there are movements with emancipatory potentials and those that remain limited by their orientation towards resistance and withdrawal as such. The old ways of exposing and opposing the state that has proved successful in the past are no longer relevant and effective within a political system where the processes and institutions available for direct participation require of civil society groups the skills of composing and proposing policy and government alternatives. We can also lend our competence in adjudicating the depth of insight and in analyzing the validity of arguments that are proposed by the state and other interest groups for the understanding of ordinary people in our society. We can colonize the public sphere. In this way, we can hasten and heighten the process of rationalization for them to be able to engage in meaningful communicative interaction on issues that affect them. My conclusion. What I have presented is an inchoate proposal. It is offered as a preamble to future efforts towards the forging of a critical theory of Philippine society. An endeavor worth pursuing, both as a matter of research, interest, and demand of our current social conditions. Critical theory calls for a new understanding of the role of philosophy and the task of philosophers. For Habermas, the intellectual life is not a game, or a career, or a cultivation of wit and taste, or even learning for learning's sake. It is above all a vocation to anticipate and to justify a better world society, one that affords greater opportunities for happiness, peace, and community. Critical theory reinvents philosophy as a socially committed and interdisciplinary enterprise of rationality, visible only through a specific ongoing relationship with parallel disciplines in the natural and above all in the social sciences. It signals the end of philosophy as many of us perhaps have known it. This conference, and I must congratulate the organizers, charts a new direction for doing philosophy in our country. It is an act of subversion, a breaching of old traditions. It is a call to transcending the present, to a renewal that is as necessary as it is possible. Thank you very much.